welcome to the first of our Faribault Diversity Coalition Speaker Series. This is going to become a monthly event. We welcome you all. We're so excited to be here today. And we wanted to take it back and start where it all began, which is with Faribault's Native history. We're very excited to announce our speaker, Sue Garwood. Sue Garwood has served as the Executive Director for the Rice County Historical Society for 19 years. She holds an undergraduate degree from St. Paul State University, and her master's degree is from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The Minnesota Alliance of Local History Museums bestowed the 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award to Sue for 30-plus years of service to organizations across Minnesota, including the Rice County Historical Society, the Northfield Historical Society, Carleton College Archives, and the Minnesota Alliance of Local History Museums. The award recognizes individuals who've made outstanding contributions and demonstrated leadership to Minnesota's history community on a broad scale. Additionally, she volunteers on the Faribault Tourism Commission, Johnston Hall Memorial Committee, Northfield to Beyond the Land Acknowledgement Committee, and she is a member of Faribault Rotary. Thank you, and let's give a warm round of applause for Sue Garwood.
Thank you so much, and it's a great audience. So glad to, as Kelly and I were saying, five days of organizing this, and what a great turnout. Thank you so much for being here. The history that I'm going to be talking about is the indigenous history of the land that's now Rice County, Minnesota. Obviously, it's important to note that the whole geographic designation of Rice County is modern. That wasn't in place until 1853. And so we're going to talk about the history of the land that we are on, and specifically the indigenous component. 10,000 years ago, the ice sheets had melted completely away. And here's an image of those ice sheets. What's important to note, let's see if this clicker works. Hot dang. What's important to note is this little corner over here that isn't covered by the last glaciation includes the southeastern corner of Rice County. If you've ever driven from Morristown all the way over to Kenyon, you can see there's a change in topography. It's a lot flatter by Morristown towards Kenyon, and that is because that part wasn't covered by glaciers. This is an example of how the Earth, this area generally, looked as that glacier receded. As I said, the glaciers began to recede about 10,000 years ago, but even though the Earth now exposed, it was too cold. The growing season was non-existent. So when people began to be in this area again, they were hunters and gatherers. They were not working the land. It's important to note that we have at the Rice County Historical Society in our collection of lithics or stone points that have been made, we have had archaeologists review that collection and put them in a timeline. We have a continuum of points in terms of shape, design, etc., from 13,000 years ago until about 1,000 years ago. So this land has supported human existence for over 13,000 years. And we'll get into it a little bit, but it's referred to as the point of first contact, the point where the first European Americans arrived. That didn't happen until 1650. So 72 years ago, something like that, is when the first European Americans were here. So 372 years versus 13,000 years. The indigenous people that were here, as I mentioned, gatherers, they were what we refer to as Paleo-Indians. We've heard of it as the Paleo diet. Not really the same, although the name has the same concept, is that these are foods that would have been naturally harvested or available and not processed, that sort of thing. Of the oldest time period, we have over 1,700 points, those lithic points in our collection. 17 of those are from the Paleo time period. So although that's only 3% of the collection, it's definite proof, as I said, that there were people here. The largest portion of our collection is from the Archaic Indian period, which is 2,000 to 7,000 years BC, and 35% of our collection is there. The Woodland and Mississippian time period, we've got about 62% of our collection is there, and so on. You may know or have heard of the great work that Larry Ritchie is doing in Walcott Township. He's a local farmer and he's a historian who's specializes in hands-on learning, and he's done some amazing work. He's done some digging actually in a farmland very close to his own farm, and in the process it's a 12-foot by 12-foot hole that he's digging out, and he describes it as a sinkhole, and in this sinkhole he has over the last 3 years found at least 9 different bison bones. He's found a ton of bison bones, but bones from 9 different bison. What I mean by that is that every bison has only one particular vertebrae, I believe it's the clavicle vertebrae, that's very distinctive, and he's found 9 of those. So there could be a whole lot more. There are hundreds of bones he's found, but 9 specifically of that one particular bone. We've had them radiocarbon dated, and not all of them, but 4 of them, and they have dated from 2,300 years to 3,600 years ago. So these are this is an interesting image of bison as they have changed. This is the oldest bison, the Bison lafrantis, Bison antiquus, and Bison prius. The bones that Larry is finding is between these two, and this is a modern bison called bison. It's interesting to note how flora and fauna, they refer to the flora and fauna that would have been here at the time, 13,000 years ago when the first native people were here. They refer to that as megaflora and fauna. There were mammoths, there were giant bison, there were big sloths, huge beavers. If you, as I say to my 3rd graders when they come through tour, if you've seen the movie Ice Age, the animals didn't talk, but those animals were here. In fact, less than 100 miles from here, the Minnesota Archaeological Society has found in a cave saber-toothed tiger bones. And knowing the area in which they traveled, that meant that right where we are, at some point in time in the past, there were bison, megasloth, and saber-toothed tigers. And that's within not a little bit before the time period we're talking about, but still the animals and the creatures that they would have been hunting and gathering would have been large. Just as a side note, when you think about 13,000 years, it's hard to, I'm referring to them as indigenous people rather than Dakota. Even the English language 1,000 years ago was very different. Old English is something that is hard to read, and even when spoken, many of us don't even understand it, even though it is English. You get 13,000 years, the opportunity for evolution and change in both language and so on is significant. Did they call themselves the Dakota? We don't know. The Dakota, however, if you ask a Dakota person, they will tell you they've been here forever. They are the ones who were here. We know the land was covered in ice, so forever isn't an option. However, their history is stronger than any, so instead what we say is that they are ancestors of the Dakota. They are the ones who came before. Very likely the many generations great-great-grands of the Dakota that were here by 1650. This is a slide of some of the shards and especially the big pot. Those were all found in Rice County, and they are a part of our collection. They are from the woodland time period, and so they're about 1,200 years old. Sioux Nation. As I said at the very beginning, it's important to remember that indigenous territories don't follow today's geographic boundaries. And so rather than try and tell you state maps and all that sort of thing, at this point in time, you can see this is a huge part of the United States, actually of the continent, where they were from. The Dakota are actually a part of a 7 council fires group. It's Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. They're actually all the same people, just with different dialects. Another good example is some of their spelling. For example, how you spell the word teepee. The Dakota that were here, they were the Wapakute. They spell it T-I-P-I. As versus the Yankton in South Dakota, they spell it T-E-E-P-E-E, like we have it. So, at any rate, but the same people, same language mostly. They had similar words. I had a Dakota friend tell me a little bit about what it is like for him as a Dakota person to speak to somebody who lives in the Black Hills area who is a Lakota person. And as they are speaking, if there's a word that there are words that they don't understand, not because they don't speak the language, but the language is different. And so somebody will say, we say it like this, and they will say, oh, well, we say it like this. So there is, even today, there are slight variations in the language that can be barriers. Just as a note, the 7 tribes, the 4, the Santee or the Eastern Dakota, those are the ones that were in Minnesota at the time of first contact. You've got the Metawakaton, that's the same group that's now, well, we'll get back to that. That means dwellers of the sacred lake. The Wapakute, those are the ones that are here. They were shooters among the leaves. Sissetuan or Sisseton are people of the marsh. Wapatuan are dwellers among the leaves. The lower Yankton are people of the end. The upper Yankton are people of the little end. And Tituan are people of the plains. To warm up, the Indians or the American Indians that were here were starting to starting to work the land and grow crops, how the village looked and the canoes and all that sort of thing. It also has a very direct Faribault connection. I'll tell it now and then we'll circle back again. Alexander Faribault, his father was Jean-Baptiste Faribault. He was a French-Canadian fur trader. His mother was Pelagie. She is a Dakota woman and had family connections with the Wabasha tribe, this group of people. During the War of 1812, the English invaded through Wisconsin and actually attacked and burned Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, where Jean-Baptiste and Alexander and family were living. The British captured all of the men, including Jean-Baptiste, held them as prisoners, and Pelagie, Alexander, and his little sister Lucy, those were the only 2 of 10 children that had been born yet. Pelagie, Alexander, and Lucy escaped in a canoe, and Pelagie paddled up the lake, and they lived with the Wabasha. The Wabasha, this tribe that's right there, sheltered them during the time period when Jean-Baptiste was held prisoner. So that's why I love this photograph. Again, I sort of jumped ahead, but we'll go back a little bit again. Just a little bit about how the Dakota were living. Dakota people lived in agreement with the land. It's its resources and its seasons. Camps were moved for that very reason. Whereas early they were hunters and gatherers and would move every couple of days. Once the land warmed up and they were able to farm, they would move seasonally. And for example, the Dakota didn't shape the land like we do now. Farmers go in and they change the land in lots of ways. We do a lot of trenching for water drainage and all that sort of thing. The Dakota instead worked the land as it was. They lived in harmony with the nature. It's important to note that today the Dakota still understand this concept, and they leave a gift, often tobacco and a prayer, when taking from the land, acknowledging that relationship, including one with the land, should be handled with reciprocity. By the way, the pieces that I share about Dakota culture actually come from, I was fortunate to attend Dakota curriculum education teaching. Darlene St. Clair, she's a professor in St. Cloud State University. She is Dakota, actually. She traces her history, her ancestors, to the Faribault Dakota, which we'll get to in a bit. But this is a training for teachers in particular of how to talk about and introduce the Dakota to school children and to work it into the curriculum. And again, I was honored to do that. And so I've, rather than even risk potentially misspeaking or misrepresenting, I've taken direct quotes from that curriculum. So that's one of them. Circling back, it's important to pause for a moment and talk about the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe had direct influence on and impact on the Dakota. The ancestors of the Ojibwe, they actually lived in northeastern part of North America along the Atlantic coast. Due to a combination of prophecies and tribal warfare, around 1,500 years ago, they left their home along the ocean and began a slow migration westward that lasted many centuries. This is where they moved to. Ojibwe oral history and archaeological records provide evidence that the Ojibwe moved slowly in small groups following the Great Lakes westward. By the time the French arrived in the Great Lakes area in the mid-1600s, the Ojibwe were well established in Sault Ste. Marie and the surrounding area. I mentioned prophecy. The Ojibwe prophecy that urged them to move west to the land where food grows on water was a clear reference to the wild rice and served as a major incentive to migrate westward. Eventually, some bands made their home in the northern area of present-day Minnesota. What's important to note is that the Dakota, who were here, were actually a lot farther north. They were in the land. They were in the northern part of the state of Minnesota, in this area. In fact, Lake Mille Lacs, thank you so much. Lake Mille Lacs was actually the center and where much of their origin story comes from. And so you can see, by the time that the European Americans were here, war between Dakota and Ojibwe had pushed the Dakota south. Another sidebar. You may have heard of the Sioux. Sioux is actually a mistranslation of, it's a French translation of Ojibwe word describing the Dakota, which means snake or snake in the grass. It's as I posted on Facebook a bit, it always fascinates me that the word calling somebody a snake is derogatory across cultures and time. At any rate, yet at the same time, some tribes and groups have embraced that name as part of their identity. A great example is the group up in Shakopee. They are the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community. So it's a word that they're preferred when referring to them as a people. They prefer the word Dakota, but it's valuable to know where the word Sioux comes from. This is an Indigenous map of Minnesota as of 1825. There was a treaty in 1825 that was between the United States and all the tribes in Minnesota. And the purpose of that treaty was to basically define boundaries. To try and figure out which tribe is and which council fire is operating in which part of the country. And they were asked to stop fighting with each other. The Dakota didn't fight amongst each other, but right along the edge of where the Dakota and the Ojibwe were, there were battles. In fact, one of the last battles between the Ojibwe and the Dakota happened in the 1850s in Shakopee, and there are actually many settlers who were there at the time who actually described that battle. There was also then for the Wapakute who were here, because they were their land was down here, they were actually fighting with the Fox, Sacs, and the Ho-Chunk in that area. They were very much considered a warlike. They were the most warlike of the 7 council fires, in part because of where they were located, because of their proximity to the enemy tribes. It was Chief Kane, who was a Wapakute chief, who signed that 1825 treaty, who described the territory. He said specific, or it has been transcribed that he said, "I will now point out the boundaries of the land where I was born. It commences at the Raccoon Fork of the Des Moines River at the mouth of the Raccoon River, thence to a small lake source of the Bear River, and thence following to Bear River to its entrance into the Missouri River a little below Council Bluffs." To translate, that means basically from Blue Earth to Red Wing, south to the Iowa border, and actually a little into Iowa, although the Fox and the Sac that were down in Iowa disagreed. The fur trade arrived here in 1650. That was, again, the point of first contact. They were the fur traders that were arriving. And really for about 150 years. The first period of turmoil was in 1830, and it can be identified through the archives of Christian missionaries and soldiers, the westward movement and the desire for more. To the Dakota moons, as they are seasonal. There's the one of them is the strawberry moon, and that's when strawberries are in bloom. And once again, they would know where the wild strawberries are blooming, so they would move to that location. With the treaties, it is a slow progression. Each one is a different treaty, each different color is a treaty, but for us, what matters, here's Faribault. The Treaty of 1851, there are actually 2 treaties. There's a Treaty of Mendota and a Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. Most of us hear about the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. In fact, that picture is a picture of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. But it's actually the Treaty of Mendota where the Metawapitan and the Wapakute were at. This one was the Yankton and other groups that went to the Upper Sioux Reservation. And you can see what they mean by the Upper Sioux. So this is where the Lower Sioux was, this is where the Upper Sioux was. It first started where the Dakota land in Minnesota was 35,000 square miles. After the treaties, it was a 20-mile strip of land, 20 miles wide along the Minnesota River. After the Treaty of 1858, that got cut in half to just 10 miles, a 10-mile strip. So here's a people who's used to half of the state now being put onto a small piece of land. Now, if you're a farmer, farming in European American ways, and the United States said, well, we gave enough land for every Dakota family to have 80 acres. That should be enough, right? But they weren't farmers. They didn't farm, remember, they're not working their land, they're working with the land. And so it really, in order to survive, they had to, in lots of ways, abandon their culture. And that is the whole, that began really 11 years of deep decline, and why the U.S.-Dakota War began. Ones who began to try and learn European American farming were called farmer Indians, a more derogatory term, sometimes called cut hairs because as you can see, the men have cut their hair. Interestingly, the women are still living traditionally. It's the men who are working to adapt in this particular image. This is the Lower Sioux Indian community, and although we don't know who this person is, it's highly possible these were the Wapakute, because after the Mendota Treaty, that was where the Dakota who had been here were relocated to. But tensions between those who wanted to resist the change and those who are willing to try and adapt sprang up. So once again, here you have a people who were living in harmony with the land, who believed in kinship relationships. They believed in supporting each other. If you had food and your neighbor or your relative did not, you gave. You split what you had. And there was no holding back. Now you have tension happening because you have some who are starting to try to grow and others who are resisting. And so now there's tension and division within their own tribes. Imagine if you're having to abandon everything you knew. You're cutting your hair. You're trying to live with different clothes. You are trying to relate, but you don't belong. You don't belong in the people, the traditional people who you have been living with, your kinships, and the white community that you're trying to adapt to doesn't accept you either. So now you are even more isolated. This is a photograph of Hazelwood Mission in Yellow Medicine, and although this photo was taken up in Yellow Medicine, it could look almost very similar to Faribault. At the time that, again, 1851, the land was open to settlement, the early European Americans who were coming, they described, in fact, Mrs. Crump, if you've ever heard of Crump Hall, she describes seeing 34 bark-covered homes along the Straight River between what's now 14th Avenue and 14th Street, excuse me, down to just south of the viaduct near Teepetonka Park. These are the kinds of homes, plus some teepees that she's finding. So here we go back, and you can see homes in the background and teepees. That was absolutely where what the very first people who came to Faribault were seeing. We have been able to prove that the Faribault Dakota, the ones who had been here, continued to be here. They were forced, they were required to move to the Lower Sioux Indian community, but although the annuities were coming in, the goods that were being sold by the shopkeepers near Morton, their prices were jacked up because they could, supply and demand. And the Dakota found that their dollars actually went a lot farther in Faribault. So they would go, in fact, we have record of Alexander escorting about 600 of them to get their annuities, and then they would return because they would shop here in Faribault. So think about that. Here's this people who are displaced, who are actually a real economic boon to the community. Yet still, there was a great deal of tension. Not everybody in the community was happy to have them here. But of particular note is what was going on near the Lower Sioux Indian community and actually in farming. 1862, actually starting in 1858, the weather was horrible. It was a dry spout happening in Minnesota. In fact, the Rice County Agricultural Society that runs the Rice County Fairs was formed in 1858. We have their original minute book, and they talk about how they're getting all ready. It's the beginning of 1858. They're ready to hold their first fair, and by August, the drought has destroyed crops, and they say, well, maybe we can't do a fair. There's nothing to show. They do a small county fair, but really the very first big one is in 59. 60 is drought again. 61, they've got a little bit. 62, again, the weather was just horrible. So now you have issues with food for the settlers because of the area, and you have the Dakota, who are new farmers, struggling, fighting their own environment. They'd have been fine because they would have moved their tribe to where the food was, had it been before the treaties. They actually, there's a very famous quote of, by the end of the summer of 1862, where they went to Andrew Mike, who is the Lower Sioux Agency storekeeper, and begged for food. He had food, but he was refusing to distribute it because the annuities hadn't arrived yet. The annuities hadn't arrived because of the Civil War, and money was coming but not arrived yet. And Merrick is the one who told the hungry Dakota to eat grass or their own dung. That has been documented. Minnesota Historical Society has verified that that was in fact what they said. It was horrible. Here are people who are starving. There's food in a larder, and the Lower Sioux Agency one man, is refusing to let them in. By the way, he had that choice because in the Upper Sioux Agency, same thing happened. That agency storekeeper let them borrow, gave food. The war didn't get up there. This was a choice that he made. On August 17th, the tent situation reached its climax when 4 Dakota hunters killed 5 settlers in Acton Township. In the middle of the night, a group of Metawakan men persuaded Little Crow to continue to fight against the United States in an all-out war. He didn't want to. He thought it was foolish. He said, "They will come like crickets. There's nothing we can do to prevent this. But we are one, we are a family, and I will do as you wish." And so, the following day, Little Crow's group attacked the Lower Sioux Agency and homesteads in Brown and Renville County. On August 19th, the group reached New Ulm, where the townspeople erected a defensive barricade. The state leaders hurried to organize an army from a population already depleted by the Civil War. Governor Alexander Ramsey placed Henry Sidley in charge of the U.S. forces that engaged the Dakota. There were several battles, and within 6 weeks, the war was over. During that 6 weeks conflict, the Dakota participants who chose violent resistance killed more than 600 settlers, including women and children. The number of Dakota casualties is unrecorded. Fewer than 1,000 Dakota out of a population of more than 7,000 participated in this war. Many actually saved the lives of citizens and joined a lodge dedicated to peace. But that wasn't enough for Minnesota. If you were Native American, you were trouble. And so Minnesota, after the war, demanded justice and absolute removal of all Dakota. After the Dakota, there were 3 weeks of trials. 3 weeks of trials for 392 Dakota men. You don't have to do the math. Well, you can. But these trials were kangaroo trials, meaning they were fast, in some cases as little as 5 minutes. There were no translators for most of them, and there was very little evidence. After the trials, 303 men were sentenced to death. It's important to note that stories have come through about why they were sentenced to death. What did they say happened? Asked if they had killed somebody, and for whatever reason, mistranslated. The Dakota defined killing somebody as including of touching your enemy. So it could have been something where they touched, stabbed, encountered in some way the enemy, and that counted as coup, or killing them. Now, there are also a number who the atrocities were grave. Whether you think that the subsequence of what happened was right or not, that's a conversation for another time. I have my own opinion. I will just simply say that it was war, and I don't think they should have been hung. I think that there are other choices, especially in war. But regardless, of those 303, it ended up only 38 were hung. And that was because of Bishop Whipple. Bishop Whipple had been a rare voice in the wilderness, as it were, a voice of reason. He believed, he saw how they were being treated. He understood the plight of hunger. He had many Dakota friends who he knew had been working to try and adapt to this new strange place, new strange life that they're being asked to do, and he asked for leniency. He actually went so far as to speak to Abraham Lincoln. In fact, there's a quote that Abraham Lincoln felt the plight of the Indians down to his boots by that bishop from Minnesota who visited him. And so that Lincoln actually reviewed the court cases, and that was how he hand wrote the list down to the 38. It's important to note that Bishop Whipple was not well liked also by much of the state at the time. Here was a man who's suggesting leniency to the enemy. In fact, during the war, Bishop Whipple and his wife Cornelia went to St. Peter to help run a hospital dealing with the refugees that are being, the settlers who are coming in off the battlefield and trying to get away. And a lynch mob forms outside of St. Peter, outside of the hospital, and they want to lynch Bishop Whipple. It is one of the citizens who gets off his hospital bed, who goes out to talk to the crowd and say, "No, you don't understand. He's here to help us." And that person who had been physically helped by Cornelia and Bishop Whipple is the one who talked the crowd down. But that was the mentality. Our own bishop almost lynched because he spoke in favor of leniency. This is a picture from, I believe it's Birch Coulee, of just one of the battle scenes. After the war, and the 303 of them were sentenced to death, and again, that number was commuted down to 38. The men were separated from the women and children. The men were all held in Mankato, even after the trials. The women, about 1,658, women, children, and the elderly were marched up to Fort Snelling, and they were held in what has been described as concentration camps. It's important to note that it wasn't a death camp, although many have said that that was something that was contributing to the genocide of that people. But rather it was disease, cold, and other extreme conditions that had devastating effects on those that were held there. An estimated 300 Dakota died in the camp from disease that winter. This is one of the Wapakute tribal chiefs, who signed the treaty. And this is actually one of my most recent efforts at research. I have been trying to find what happened to the Wapakute. Where did they go? The Wapakute were the smallest group. They were a lot of the warrior group. So there were about 600 of them at the start of the war, and much fewer by the end of the war. Hushasha, or Red Legs, was one of the men, he was the lead chief that signed the treaty, signed the 1851 Treaty of Mendota, and it was really his people who, all of the Wapakute, were really under him. There's a second individual, also born in, so he was born on Cannon Lake, and another Dakota or Wapakute person who was born on Dakota Lake on Cannon Lake was Inkpaduta, and Inkpaduta refused to sign the treaty. So here in Rice County, we have a unique situation where you've got one Dakota person who signs the treaty and their tribe and what happens with that tribe, and another tribe that doesn't sign the treaty and what happens there. Inkpaduta and his group still lost all their land. They got no financial help, no annuities, They were separated from their family, and by 1857, most of them, they were down to about 40 families, from over 100. In 1857, Inkpaduta and his tribe attacked Spirit Lake Massacre in Iowa, and killed all of the settlers that were in that village. They were chased out of Iowa, chased out of Minnesota, and actually settled in Canada. So, once again, half of the Dakota that were here ended up in Canada. Hushasha, as the other half, his group actually ended up in Nebraska. So, what's key here is when thinking about the Dakota who were in Faribault or Rice County, you have to think of them in two groups. The Wapakute, who were here before the 1862 war, they and their descendants now are in Nebraska. The Faribault Dakota, who were here after the war, which we'll talk about next, they were the Metawakitan, and they are now still in Minnesota, in the area. I mentioned Bishop Whipple at the beginning of February in 1863. Bishop Whipple wrote, "All of the innocent Dakota and their families had been confined at the Fort Snelling camp. Whipple sought relief for the families left behind. In response to his concerns, Sibley said that he'd have to send them up the Missouri River to Nebraska, including those who hadn't fought. Whipple begged the general to let him bring a few families to Faribault. When Sibley asked how they would be taken care of, the bishop could only say that he would find a way. Surprisingly, Sibley said yes, and approximately 80 families came to Faribault. Whipple went to Alexander Faribault and said, 'Can you help?' And Faribault said, 'Yes, put them on my land.' He had about a 250-acre farm in what is now the Blind School and Riverbend Nature Center. And the families stayed there, those who had been friendly. Some of the townspeople were greatly opposed to their arrival. In fact, D.O. Brown, the editor of the local paper, was known for his extremist views against the Dakota. He wrote, "The settlers are too generous to any portion of this fair earth, those fiends who pollute the foulest region of hell by being colonized there." He's referring to the Dakota. Whipple recalled that there was much excitement over the issue and foolish threats that were made again against himself and Alexander. And Alexander wrote a letter to the editor to try and assure them of who was here and that these men were safe. This is where they were living, and Teope would be one of the local Dakota who is well known. On June 12, 1866, Special Indian Agent Adams visited the city of Faribault. So this is an Indian agent sent from Washington, D.C., and he went to look in on the encampment that was here. He counted by that point in time 12 families, or 65 people, and he wrote, "Altogether, 14 of whom are men, and they still live in teepees." He concluded that the Indians were almost wholly dependent on Alexander Faribault for assistance. He continued to write, "When he has work for them, which is only a portion of the time they work for him, and he pays them wages. When they need flour, he lets them have it from his mill without certainty of getting paid. White people do not employ the Indians. On the whole, it is quite apparent that these people are now living upon and must continue to depend upon the charity of Mr. Faribault, who cannot afford such liberality." In 1863, while Congress stripped the Dakota of the Minnesota lands, it authorized the Department of Interior to allocate to 80 acres of land to each loyalist, or Faribault Dakota, yet the risk of a lynch mob was too high, and they didn't feel comfortable leaving Alexander's protection until he died. In 1882, who had been the strongest, when he died in 1882, he had been the strongest advocate, the protector. It was time now, and after his death, the Faribault Dakota exercised their legal right to purchase those 80 acres, and they began to, some of their exiled families who had been sent off to Nebraska also returned. Together, those communities, so the Faribault Dakota and the ones who had come, their families who returned from Nebraska, they established Prairie Island, Shakopee Metawakan, and the Upper and the Lower Sioux agencies. So when you travel around, Faribault, a very unique place, had a great impact on the Dakota who are here today. I have to say for a moment about boarding schools. Whipple, it was actually Whipple's vision of boarding schools. You don't have to be, you don't have to work very hard to imagine that. He started 3 of them up on the hill: St. James, St. Mary, and Shattuck. He believed in the importance. He went to boarding school. He believed in the importance of education. That is how you succeed. You have to know. You have to be well informed in order to succeed. And you had 2 different experiences. There were Dakota and Ojibwe who went to school at Shattuck. One of them actually became a reverend, and his great-granddaughter actually visited the museum recently doing some history, and she said, we know about our family because one of the few who know about our family history because we had literate ancestors and they were able to write. On the other hand, you had the other experience that you're hearing a lot about in the news lately, and boarding schools were devastating. Culturally and so on. There's a big difference of choice. Bishop Whipple and the boarding schools here in town, the Dakota and the Ojibwe, were asked, would you like to send your child here? And the ones who were here said yes. They were able to visit their families. They still had to cut their hair and they had to wear the uniforms, but they weren't asked to completely separate. The boarding schools that you're hearing about today in the news, those are ones where they were forced. There was no choice. Children were taken. Interestingly, Jeff Jarvis, who's doing some really great research and work to try and also continue to tell the story of the Dakota, he talked to Carlisle Indian School, which is out east, has recently created an online database of all of their images. And he found, one of the friends that he and I both have, Walter Labatt, he found his parents. He found Walter's parents in that boarding school. And Jeff told the story about he contacted Walter and said, I hate to do this to you, but I thought you might want to know. I found your family. And boy, it must have been really tough. And Walter said, you know, my dad became a lawyer because of that. We don't think of the boarding school as a horrible place. For some it was, for some it wasn't. And so it's important to keep in mind, to look for the nuances, to remember that the experience of one Dakota, the experience of one Indian isn't always the same as another. I've talked about the past, but it's important to remember that they are still here. In fact, this organization called We Are Still Here Minnesota is actually founded by Ramona Kiddo Stately. I don't know if you've had a chance to or are familiar with her at all. She describes herself as she's an enrolled member of the Santee Sioux Dakota Nation. She has a BA in Dakota Art and Culture and Masters of Education with emphasis on teacher leadership from Augsburg University. After 15 years of teaching Indian education in Minnesota, she is now project director of the We Are Still Here Minnesota, creating action for narrative change. Ramona is the mother of 2 children, an accomplished bead worker, and what she is saying is, remember the past, but don't speak about the Dakota and the Indians as though they are no longer here, because they are. They are thriving and they are making a difference. In fact, our lieutenant governor is a Dakota, or is an Indigenous person. An extra little plug, by the way, Ramona is Wapakute. So one of the very few. And I know that this is rare because one of my first, in fact, it was she who confirmed my findings that the Wapakute, the history of the Wapakute, are in Santee Sioux, or in Nebraska. and she doesn't know their history. She's been asking us to help because their history was gone. Their history was eradicated completely. They were absorbed. They're the smallest group. They were absorbed in the Mdewakanton tribe. And so trying to tease out Wapakute versus Mdewakanton is a challenge. What can we do? What can we do today? How can we think about, respond to, and take action on the experience of the past? You can remember that they're still here, acknowledge and value their experience, but you could also do something that Northfield did. I'm not saying that we should, but it's an interesting piece. This is a new sculpture that just went up in Northfield. It's a Northfield eagle sculpture, and they have written their land acknowledgement statement. Land acknowledgement statement is literally a statement that is adopted by a community that acknowledges those who came before. In this particular case, I'll just read it. It says, "We stand on the homeland of the Wapakute band of the Dakota Nation. We honor with gratitude the people who have stewarded the land throughout generations and their ongoing contributions to this region. We acknowledge the ongoing injustices that we have committed against the Dakota Nation, and we wish to interrupt this legacy, beginning with acts of healing and honest storytelling about this place." I will say that there's a little bit more mea culpa in that one than there is typically in land acknowledgement statements, but I think it's something I would challenge the community to consider, reminding folks that this land was Dakota land. Don't have to do anything more with that. The Dakota aren't asking for that. The Dakota are just simply wanting to be remembered, wanting to be acknowledged. And again, I'm getting that from both my literature, my training, as well as from my conversations with both Darlene, who traces her history to the Faribault Dakota after the U.S.-Dakota War, and Ramona, who traces her history to the Dakota who were here before the U.S.-Dakota War. If you're interested in learning more, as I mentioned, the 4 tribal communities in Minnesota all trace their history to Faribault, so that's super cool. If you haven't had a chance to do it, I strongly recommend going up to Shakopee, to Hochakatati. It is their cultural center and gathering place, and they have a beautiful museum. And they talk about a lot of this history. It's interactive. They talk about their culture and all kinds of things. It's a great place. Their hours are mostly Friday through the weekend, but you can find them online or give them a call. All right, a long story, big history, 13,000 years.